Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. The United States and European Union have reached a trade deal framework ending a months-long standoff. The agreement includes a 15% US tariffs on EU goods, half of the threatened 30% with zero tariff access for certain US exports to Europe. US President Donald Trump has said that he's shortening the 50-day deadline he previously gave Russia to end its war in Ukraine. He further stated his disappointment and confirmed the deadline would now be a lesser number, but did not specify a new timeframe. US President Donald Trump has said that he told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the fight in Gaza against Hamas must be different. President Trump expressed concern for Gaza's civilians, stressing they needed food and safety right now. He also said that Gaza's ceasefire is still possible. These comments come amid his current visit to the United Kingdom. Thailand and Cambodia have now agreed to a ceasefire deal. This was facilitated in Malaysia by Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim amid border clashes. China and US have also expressed support for diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions. The ceasefire deal comes as the conflict already claimed dozens of lives and displaced over 130,000 people. Israeli rights groups B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights Israel have now declared that Israel's ongoing military campaign in Gaza amounts to genocide against Palestinians, according to media reports. The groups said their conclusion is based on the scale of destruction and loss of civilian life in the ongoing war. India's Defense Minister Rajnath Singh has once again denied claims that New Delhi bowed to US pressure to end its conflict with Pakistan in May, rejecting President Donald Trump's statement that he brokered a ceasefire. Singh stated that India concluded its military operation earlier, achieving all its objectives not due to external intervention. Google has now admitted that its Android earthquake alert system failed to properly warn millions during Turkey's devastating 7.8 magnitude earthquake back in 2023. According to a media investigation, only 469 take action warnings were sent despite 10 million people being within the range, revealing flaws that Google describes as a global safety net. Firefighters in Turkey and Albania are battling wildfires fueled by strong winds and scorching heat. In Turkey's Karabük province, where wildfire has raged for 6 straight days, forcing the evacuation of over a dozen villages and destroying large areas of forest. Similar fires near tourist areas in Albania have raised concerns as the region struggles with extreme summer conditions this year. Now, US President Donald Trump has announced he is considering cutting short the 50-day deadline he set earlier for Russian President Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine. Speaking at his Turnberry Golf Resort in Scotland, Trump expressed disappointment in Putin's actions, particularly after repeated ceasefire talks failed. Earlier in July, President Trump warned that if President Putin did not reach a deal with Ukraine by early September, he would impose 100% secondary tariffs on Russia and any countries continuing to trade with it. These tariffs would significantly impact nations like India and China, who maintain trade relations with Moscow despite existing Western sanctions. Trump has criticized Putin's continued military actions, specifically recent missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, which he said have resulted in civilian casualties. He also stated that he might reduce the 50-day ultimatum, as he believed he already knew the outcome of this situation. Here's what he had to say.
We've had discussions, you and I have had discussions. Yeah. We thought we had that settled numerous times. And then President Putin goes out and starts launching rockets into some city like Kiev. and kills a lot of people in a nursing home or whatever. You have bodies lying all over the street. And I say that's not the way to do it. So we'll see what happens with that. I'm very disappointed. I'm disappointed in President Putin. Very disappointed in him. So we're going to have to look, and I'm going to reduce that 50 days that I gave him to a lesser number because I think I already know the answer what's going to happen.
Now for this discussion, we're joined by Raymond Vickery. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce, joins us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you, Raymond, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, President Donald Trump has suggested that he is willing to decrease this deadline that was given earlier, which was 50 days to Russia. Do you think it still holds any impact? Is this realistic for this kind of pressure from President Trump to push Putin towards a ceasefire, according to you?
Well, thanks very much for having me. It seems to me that President Trump is finally waking up to the fact that you can't conduct business with President Putin like a real estate deal, that it's a transaction and one-off. You may recall that he said that the Ukraine invasion by Russia was going to be solved on day one in the White House. And of course, that hasn't happened, and it's a completely unrealistic way to approach foreign affairs. I think the awakening of Trump to the reality of what Putin is doing, and that is really a resort to the old-time imperialism of being able to invade and control territory, is welcome. But what is required here is a return to some semblance of international cooperation on this problem which affects the peace and prosperity of the entire world. Europe, India, all of the great democracies have a stake in this, and it takes a coordinated approach. Now, just to say that you're going to impose secondary tariffs and that's going to end it, that's not realistic. You have to deal with those who've been reluctant to cut off Putin in regard to income from oil, such as India, and you have to be able to have a coordinated approach. So this is some progress in the mindset of President Trump, but it is certainly not sufficient in order to solve this problem which affects the peace and prosperity of the entire world.
And Raymond, I would also like to ask, how realistic is his threat to impose 100% secondary tariffs on countries trading with Russia, such as India, where I am at? And what impact could this have on nations like India?
Well, it's not realistic at all. What has to happen, and I'm all in favor of cutting off income that Putin is using for this invasion, but you can't do it just by saying we're going to impose the tariffs and it's my way or the highway. What you have to do is get cooperation with India, with Japan, even China, if you will, to try to be able to rein this in. It remains to be seen whether or not Trump would actually follow through on any of this, and what he's doing is just creating additional uncertainty. But that seems to be his stock in trade, to try to create chaos and then somehow claim victory out of the chaos. So what one would hope would happen is that Trump would coordinate with Prime Minister Modi, other leaders of the world, in order to have a coalition which deters Putin from the path which he's on. That's going to be much more effective than the kind of up and down threats one day, extensions the next, in order to try to have a system in the international arena.
And Raymond, also now going back to the 50-day that's shortened now to 10 to 12 days, what are the potential risks and consequences of this deadline again? Like you said that, threatening and then taking it back and threatening and then taking it back. Do you think there is now a trust issue between President Trump and Putin where like before they seemed to have good relations?
Well, the seeming good relations were really a mirage. President Putin is very much in the mode of a 19th century imperialist. And that is, he wants to restore what he conceives to be Russian greatness by resort to the old-time way of doing that. And whether it be Alexander the Great, Peter the Great, the British Empire, and that is you invade and take over a country, territory which you want. This is the mindset. The supposed good relations between Trump and Putin certainly didn't affect Putin's way of thinking. The problem here is the one of inconsistency and the room for miscalculation. And miscalculation, when you're talking about the world's two largest nuclear powers, is incalculable in terms of the downside. And so what one hopes would happen is a return to the principles of the United Nations Charter, to work with others, yes, to provide sanctions, but as you need sticks, you also need carrots in order to try to resolve this and have peace and stability. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is really the first breach of the principles which were agreed to after World War II of non-intervention by one state against another. Sure, we've had problems in regard to terrorism. We've had all kinds of economic discontinuities. But this is really a singular action on behalf of Putin and requires coordinated action among the democracies of the world to try to rein it in. This business of, well, we'll shorten the deadline has no effect.
Thank you very much, Raymond, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we will come back to you for our discussion. Now we move on to our next news. Donald Trump is now pushing for urgent action in Gaza after talks with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Scotland. He also warned of a growing humanitarian crisis and said the US plans to set up walk-in food centers in Gaza. Trump is also in contact with Israel's leadership and working with Prime Minister Keir Starmer on a ceasefire plan and long-term strategy for the region. Let's listen in to what the US President Donald Trump has said.
You know, you've seen the areas where they actually have food, and the people are screaming for the food, and they're 35, 40 yards away, and they won't let them because they have lines that are set up. And whether they're set up by Hamas or whoever, but they're very strict lines, so we have to get rid of those lines. But we're going to be getting some good, strong food. We can save a lot of people. I mean, some of those kids that's real starvation stuff. I see it. And you can't fake that. So we're going to be even more involved. We did some airlifts before, some airdrops, and the people are running for it. So we're going to set up food centers and where the people can walk in and no boundaries. We're not going to have fences and, you know, they can't, they see the food from 30 you would say, yards away, and they see the food. It's all there, but nobody's at it because they have fences set up that nobody can even get it. It's crazy what's going on over there.
Now we're joined for this discussion by Adrian Calamere. He's a terrorism scholar, joins us live from New York. Thank you, Adrian, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now,
good to see you.
Good to see you. Now, how is your reaction? What's your reaction, I would like to know, about the ceasefire? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Is this happening finally?
Good to see you, Asuma. Good evening to all your viewers. I just don't see it happening. We're still not at a phase. We have to remember that Steve Witkoff just came back from more negotiations with Hamas, and I think he finally come to the realization that they're not going to negotiate in good faith. Really what we're seeing right now is a tactic, and this has been the tactic since Hamas has started to go on the losing side of this, is to weaponize aid, to weaponize this, to use the propaganda game against Israel, and not so Israel can't reach its strategic objectives, which is getting the hostages back, and number two, making sure that Hamas cannot reconstitute and commit this kind of atrocity again from the Gaza Strip. I just don't understand why the world looks at Hamas in a different light than they do with ISIS. They're really same, different sides of the same coin. They operate the same way, and we need to understand that when Trump is saying it's fenced off, they can't get to it. Well, the reason why they can't get to it is because Hamas will only accept aid from the UN, okay, because they're in bed with them and with their agencies. And the agencies that have been set up, such as the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, that's available, but Hamas will not take the aid from them. So now Israel, the combatant nation, is dropping. I mean, Trump's taking credit for this, but it's Israel that's making these drops into Gaza of humanitarian aid. So it does need to be resolved. I think the best way to resolve this and to get this to a ceasefire or an end of the war is get the population out of there, get the civilians out of there, set up, and this has been the answer for a long time, set up a mobile area in Sinai, finish the job in Gaza, and then rebuild Gaza and then move the Palestinian population back into the Strip. So there's no more, there's no more civilians there, but they're using civilians, they're using aid against Israel and to play a very weak hand and win their objectives, which is to hold control of Gaza.
And Adrian, you've also mentioned that if the economic or commerce in that region increases in value, then maybe there can be ceasefire. So what role can economic sanctions or incentives play in supporting long-term peace and rebuilding efforts in Gaza after maybe a ceasefire?
Well, I think a lot of the economic incentives and a lot of talks have been going through Qatar, and that's where everything's been mediated. In Qatar, we have to remember that they are the patron of Hamas. So when you look at financial incentives, I think people need to understand the Hamas ideology, and money cannot override ideology in many cases, and especially this case. So I don't see financial incentives playing a part unless you can prove to the people, the Palestinian people, that there is a better alternative than Hamas, one that keeps you in starvation, the one that brutalizes you, the one that brings you into a war that you didn't want any part of. There is an alternative, and that is one that has a proper economy, a proper government that isn't overseen by a bunch of kleptocrats who are stealing everything from the people, which has been the history of Hamas. And even if you look at the PLO with Yasser Arafat, and you look at the PA, even today, Mahmoud Abbas, he's not looked at as a legitimate leader. So financial incentives definitely play a part in the rebuilding and the day after, but not if Hamas is there, because the money part means nothing to them.
Yes. Thank you very much, Adrian Calamari, for joining us and sharing your insight as a terrorism scholar. Please stay with us as we'll come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we stay in the region. Two major Israeli human rights groups, B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights, have both accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. In new reports, they say civilians have been targeted based on their Palestinian identity, causing irreversible harm. They are also calling on Western allies to intervene, citing a legal and moral obligation to stop this violence. Let's listen into what the organizations have to say.
Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The report written by us at B'Tselem presents facts, data, and testimonies about how Israel is acting in a deliberate, coordinated, and systematic way to destroy the Palestinians in Gaza.
שני הדוחות שיוצגו בפניכם מיד, אשר נכתבו על ידי שני ארגוני זכויות אדם מרכזיים, הפועלים בישראל מזה עשרות שנים, רופאים לזכויות אדם ובצלם, ומתבססים על מחקר יסודי ומעמיק, הגיעו למסקנה אחת. ישראל מבצעת ג'נוסייד בעזה.
Now we go back to our guest discussion with Adrian Calamel. Thank you, Adrian, for staying with us. Now, this is huge that two organizations have come out from Israel and said that they are committing a genocide. Can you tell us how significant is this?
Well, that's a tough one. It's significant that there's groups within Israel making this claim of genocide, but I think it's also very significant that the world has lost the understanding of what the term genocide actually means and look at examples from history. This isn't Pol Pot. This isn't a genocide that is taking place. What this is a war taking place. This isn't a deliberate extermination of people, which is a genocide. And they may say that they've got the data points and all et cetera, but show the data to the world. The claims of genocide throughout historical conflict, understanding conflict, these are human rights NGO groups. They don't understand the very definition when you look at Geneva Conventions, when you look at other type of parameters, the Rome statutes, that look at what genocide actually amounts to. And what Israel is doing right here, moving civilian populations away from conflict areas, constantly moving them around a sandbox is to avoid civilian and collateral damage. That's not genocide. So it's significant that you have a group in Israel doing this. It's putting more pressure on the Netanyahu government. It's putting more pressure on the state of Israel, and I really think it's rather unhelpful for the Israelis for groups inside Israel to claim this is a genocide when, if you look at the clear parameters of this, and there's going to be lots of people that disagree with me, but if you look at the facts, this isn't genocide.
Yes, thank you very much, Adrian Calamel, for joining us and sharing your insight as a terrorism scholar. Now we move on to our next news. U.S. senators from both parties are set to introduce 3 new bipartisan bills this week targeting China over its human rights abuses, treatment of dissidents, and military pressure on Taiwan. The legislation highlights growing concerns in Congress that President Donald Trump's focus on trade talks with Beijing is overshadowing national security and human rights priorities. The bills, backed by both Democrats and Republicans, mark a rare moment of unity in Washington. While many lawmakers support Trump's push for a better trade deal, some China hawks worry the administration is downplaying China's broader threat. Democratic Senator Jeff Markey, a lead sponsor, warned that the U.S. cannot afford to appear weak in the face of Chinese aggression and called for American foreign policy to remain rooted in freedom and human rights, regardless of who is president. The White House insists Trump is committed to Asia-Pacific security while maintaining good relations with Chinese President Xi Jinping. China has not yet responded to the proposed legislation. Now we go back to our discussion with Raymond Vickery. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce. Thank you, Raymond, for staying with us. Now, given this rare bipartisan support for these bills, how might this influence the future U.S. foreign policy, particularly in terms of aligning both parties on issues related to China?
Well, thanks again for having me. It seems to me that this latest action, the introduction of these 3 bills having to do with the human rights of Uyghurs and Taiwan, are significant. You know, President Trump has looked at the world in transactional terms. I'm going to make a deal on economic relations and that will solve problems. But values are still important to many people who are in the Congress and in politics in the United States. And it seems to me that these three bills with bipartisan support show the continuing saliency of values in the foreign policy of the United States. The one by Senator Cornyn from Texas is particularly important because he is in leadership. This is one which emphasizes the rights of the Uyghurs and human rights generally, which have been tread on by China. So I think that this will have some effect. The interesting part is going to be as to how much President Trump and Secretary Rubio are going to pay attention to this. As I've said, their approach is one of transactions and being able to say, yes, President Trump is the greatest thing ever, and to have others who are taking a broader point of view is not necessarily in their playbook. So this is going to require some further coordination in Washington to get values back into American foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Raymond Vickery, for joining us and sharing your insight as a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce all the way from Washington. Now we move on to our next news. EU's top negotiator, Maroš Šefčovič, defended the recent EU-US trade agreement, describing it as the best possible outcome under difficult circumstances. The deal, which was struck by EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen and US President Donald Trump, prevents a trade war by imposing a 15% tariff on EU exports to the US, while US exports to Europe will remain tariff-free. Šefčovič emphasized that the agreement was a preferable alternative to a trade war, which could result in tariffs as high as 30% halting transatlantic trade, despite some criticism, including from French Prime Minister François Bayrou, who called it a dark day. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez voiced cautious support for the deal, saying he backed it without any enthusiasm. Spain, while less exposed to the U.S. market, expressed concerns about sectors like olive oil and wine, which are more vulnerable to the higher tariffs. Let's listen into what Spanish Prime Minister had to say.
Valoro el esfuerzo que ha hecho la Comisión Europea. Valoro la actitud constructiva y negociadora que ha tenido la presidenta de la Comisión Europea y, en todo caso, respaldo este acuerdo comercial, pero lo hago sin ningún entusiasmo.
The EU hopes the agreement will avert further escalation while keeping trade relations with the US intact. Now we are joined by Peter Cordillo. He's a chief market economist at Spartan Capital Securities. Joins us live from Rome, Italy. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. And we had many discussions on this, and you called it right. You said that there will be a trade deal, and now there is a trade deal. So how significant is this, that 15% tariff is the trade deal here?
Well, you know, it's significant, but certainly it's not the greatest deal that the EU could have asked for, and I suspect that it's not the greatest deal that the United States wanted. But of course, they did come to some sort of a compromise, and of course, 15% tariffs is a steep level. And as I said before on your shows, that eventually that's going to show up in the inflationary indices, and so we could be looking at higher inflation over the next 6 to 7 months. But I think the real sticky point here is that the United States is more and more turning to protectionism. And that's not good, because that means that the global economy can slow down. That means that our economy can slow down. So the combination of higher inflation from the tariffs and slowing economic growth usually results in a bad case of stagflation, and the markets usually don't like that. So I think, if you look at some of the reactions, I mean, President Trump said that this was the biggest deal ever, obviously. If you heard the representative of the EU, the president of the EU, she says that this was a good deal under the circumstances. But if you notice, France is not happy with it, and neither is Spain. Spain and France, of course, have backed it because they have no choice, but they're not really enthused about this deal. And if you look at the reaction of the global markets, I would kind of think that we're not seeing, a vivacious run-up in stocks. And in Europe, they reversed course and actually went down. In Asia, they were mixed. Here in the States, they're doing a little bit better than Friday, but certainly nothing that would suggest that we have a market that's in orbit at this time.
Yes. Thank you very much, Peter Colillo, for joining us and sharing your insight as a chief market economist at Spartan Capital Securities. Join us live from Rome, Italy. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.